Okay, welcome back to the third and final part of this tutorial series. We'll not waste any time here, so let's get straight into making the meat. And for that, I will press Shift A, go to Mesh, and add a cube. And I'll set the size to 0.1. After that, I will add a subdivision surface modifier and set the levels to 3. Then I will right click and shade smooth. Once that's done, I will enter edit mode, right click and choose subdivide in this menu. And I'll increase the number of cuts to 4. Then I will scale this down a bit along the Z-axis and also along the X-axis. And a little bit along the Y-axis as well. Then I can take some of these vertex points and with proportional editing on, I will grab them with G and move them around to make it look more like a piece of meat. I will also add a displace modifier to this object and set the strength to a low value like 0.005. Create a new texture and go over to the texture properties and set the type to clouds. Then I'll reduce the size. And something like this should work. Now I can scale this object down and position it where I want it. And I'll also duplicate it 2 times using Shift D. I will modify these copies later, but first I will give these objects a material. And we can call it meat. Then I'll select the 2 other objects, and finally the one with the material. Press Ctrl L and link the materials. Now for this material, we can reuse most of the stuff we used for the chopsticks. So I just select one of the chopsticks, select these nodes and copy them with Ctrl C, and then go back to the meat material and paste them with Ctrl V. Now I will change the color here slightly. So the color I will use instead is this one. Then over here, I will reduce this highlight value to 4. And do the same for this one here. Now we can edit these further in edit mode. But before I do that, I will just toggle these options for the displace modifier so that it will look the same in edit mode. If you want, you can also adjust the stops on the color ramps to change how the highlights look. And that's all for the meat. Now it's time to make the green onions, and for that I'll press Shift A, go to Mesh and add a circle. Right now it's very big, so I'll reduce the radius to 0.1. I'll then press slash on the numpad to isolate the object, and then I'll enter edit mode by pressing tab. Then, with all vertices selected, I can press E and then C to extrude it up along the Z axis. Something like this should work. I can also press S and then Shift C to scale it in slightly along the X and Y axis. I will then go to the modifier properties and add a solidify modifier. And I'll adjust the thickness slightly to something like this. Then I'll add a bevel modifier. And I'll increase the segments to 3. I'll also adjust the height of it by scaling it slightly along the Z axis. And then I'll add a subdivision surface modifier. And I only need one level here, so I'll reduce the number of levels for the render so it also has one level. Then, with the object selected, I'll right click and choose Shade Smooth. You can then adjust the scale of it further if you want. And you can also select some parts of it, and with proportional editing, you can use G to deform it, so that it isn't a perfect circle. You can also scale some parts up or down if you want. When you're happy with the way it looks, you can exit edit mode. Then press slash to see the rest of the scene again. Then you can scale it down and place it in the bowl. Next, it's time to give this object a material. So with the object selected, I can go over here and create a new material. And I'll call it green onion. Then I'll delete the principled BSDF node and instead add a noise texture. Then I can press Ctrl T to get the mapping and coordinate nodes. And I'll use object here. Then I can increase the noise scale value here a bit. And then adjust the X scale and the Y scale here. To get something that looks like this. And I'll reduce the noise scale slightly. So something like this should work. Then I'll add a diffuse BSDF node, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp. And I'll set the interpolation to constant. This is where we will define the shadows and midtones. And I'll adjust the stops here slightly. And here are the values I use. Then I want to mix this together with the texture. So to do that, we can add a mix color node. And place it in between here. Then I'll take the FAG output from this noise texture and plug that into the B input. Then I'll set the factor to 1 and change the blending mode to screen. And this combines these two. And you can use the factor to control the visibility of the texture. But I'll leave it at 1. Then to add some color to this, we can duplicate the mix color node and place it here. And change the blending mode to multiply. Then here we can pick the color we want, and I'll give it this green color. We'll also want some highlights, so to get those we can add a glossy BSDF, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp. Connect them like this, and then change the interpolation to constant. And then we can use this stop to control where the highlight should go. And you can also play with the roughness value here if you want. Then we want to combine this with the rest of the material. So to do that, we can duplicate this mix color node and place it here. Then I'll set the blending mode to mix and use this as the factor. And we can plug this one into the A input. Then we can increase the value here, and the value I'll use here is 1.2. I also want this object to have an outline around it, so I'll go over to the material properties, add a new material slot, and then add the outline 2 here. Then we can go to the modifier properties, add a solidify modifier, set the material offset to 100, flip the normals, and set the offset to 1. Then I'll set the thickness to a low value, like 0.001, or maybe try a little bit higher, like 0.003. And that was maybe a bit too much, so I make it slightly thinner, so I'll go for 0.002. Now we want to create some copies of this object and scatter it around the ball. But I don't want the copies to all have the exact same shade of green. I want some slight variation. And the way we can get that is by going back to the material. Then I'll duplicate this object a few times with Shift D. And then I'll add a hue saturation value node and put it here at the end. Then here we can tweak the hue, saturation and value. But right now it changes all of them, and that's not what we want. We want it to be randomized on the objects. And the way we can do that is by adding a object info node. And this node has this random output. So what we can do is take that and plug it into the FAQ of this node. And now, if we adjust these values, we can see how we get some random color variation. And we can then play with these values to give it some subtle variation. I'll go for something like this, where it's just a very slight variation in the color. Then I'll select these copies and delete them. And instead I'll create one copy at a time. So just duplicate it, move it around and place it where you want it. Then you can also rotate it and go into edit mode and tweak it with proportional editing on to give it some organic variation. Then just repeat that for as many times as you want. Now, just having green colors for these onions looks a bit too repetitive, so I also want some white ones. And there are different ways we can make some of them white. One option is to do it in the same material, and that can be done by first adding a color ramp, and then for the first color, I'll use this green one. Then for the second color, I'll use this color here. Then I'll switch the interpolation to constant. And then, if I move this stop, you'll see how it shifts the color of them. But right now it shifts the color for all of them. So to give it some variation, where some of them are green and some of them are white, we can randomize it by using the object info node here as well. Then take the random output and plug that into the FAQ. And now some of them are white and some of them are green. And you can adjust the amount of each color by adjusting these color stops here. So if I put this stop all the way over here, you'll see how that makes most of these white. And then we only get one green one here. And if I put it in the middle, it's more equally distributed. Now, I also want to be able to adjust the random seed. So what I'll do next is move this down a bit to get a bit more space to work with. Then I'll take a white noise texture, set the dimensions to 1D, and then we can plug the random output into the W, and that already gave us a different seed. But we want to be able to control it ourselves, so I'll also add a math node and place it in between here. And now, if we adjust the value here, we'll see how that changes the seed. And then we can also adjust these stops here to tweak the amount of each color to our liking. Now, we still need to make the material actually use these random colors. And to do that, we can take the output from this color ramp and plug that into the mix node, where we set our green color previously. Then we also have to link it to the mix node where we set the highlight. But we want it to be slightly brighter, like it was here before. So here we use the value of 1.2, and that's the value I still want to use for both the green and white onions. Now, the first idea might be to just use a hue saturation value node in between. And then simply set the value here to 1.2. And that actually works well with the white onions. But if we look at the green ones, the highlight here is nowhere near the same intensity it had before. It's way dimmer than it used to be. And the reason why is because with this value here, we are not actually setting the number the value for our colors should be at. We are actually picking the value we should multiply the current color value with. So if we look at the lighter color here, we can see that this color has a value of 1, which means that when it goes through the HSV node and we set the value at 1.2, it multiplies 1 by 1.2, and that returns 1.2 as the value. And that is the value we wanted for the highlights. But then, if we look at the green color here, we can see that the value for this one is at 0.195. And that means that when the green color goes through the HSV node, it multiplies 0.195 by 1.2, which only results in a value of 0.234, and that is nowhere near the value of 1.2 that we want. So for the green highlight to actually be at 1.2, we would have to multiply it with around 6.15, and then the green one would look good. But then, if we look at the white one, that is now super bright, because we are at the same time multiplying the white color's value of 1 by 6.15, which means that the white onion's value now is much higher than the value of 1.2, which we want for both colors. So we can't use this node to do this, because one color will always be too bright or too dim. So what we need to do instead is somehow make the value always be 1.2 for any color we use, and never go above or below that number. And the way we can do that is by first taking a separate color node and take the color amp's output and plug it into the color input. Then we can set the mode to HSV, so we get the value output here. And then we can also take a combine color node and set the mode for that one to HSV as well. Then we can link the hue and saturation directly into their corresponding inputs on the combine node, because we want those to be the same. Then for the value, we want that to be set to 1.2, so we can just type that here directly. And that sets the value for both colors to 1.2. And now, if we link this combine node into the mix color node, where we set the highlight colors, we can now see that both the green and the white onions look good, because now both colors have the same value. And if you want to adjust the intensity of the highlights, you can just change the value here. Now, if you don't want the colors to be randomized, and instead want full control over exactly which onions should be green and which should be white, like if you know that you want this specific one to be white and this one to be green, then you could also just use two separate materials. So we could just delete these nodes, but first let's copy the color for the white ones. Then you can delete these nodes to go back to the simple green material. And then you can go over here and create a duplicate of this material. And you could call it something like white onion, for example. Then just go over here and change the color, so we paste in the same color we used earlier for the white ones. You can also drag that over to the highlight color and increase the value a bit, to 1.2 for example. Then you could just manually change the material on some of your green onions to the white one. It's totally up to you which method you prefer to use. For some of my onions, I'm also going to select a few faces, then press X and delete them, just to get a bit more variation. And now these are done as well, and the only thing left to do now is the steam. And to make the steam, I'll start by pressing Shift A, go to Mesh and add a plane. I'll then reduce the size to, let's say, 0.35. Then I'll rotate it 90 degrees along the X-axis. We can then create a new material for this plane, and I'll call it Steam. Then I'll delete the principled BSDF node, and instead I'll add a noise texture. Then I can press Ctrl T to get the mapping and texture coordinate nodes, and I'll use the object output here. Then I have some specific values I'll use for the noise texture. I'll set the scale to 9, the detail to 5, the roughness to 0.3, and the distortion to 1.6. Then to make this look even more like Steam, we can also adjust the X scale on the mapping node. And I'll set that to 4. Next, I'll add a color ramp. And I'll take the black stop and move it in. Then I'll also take the white stop and move that in a bit as well. Something like this should work. After that, we can add a mix shader node. And I'll plug the color ramp into the FAC input. Then I'll add a transparent BSDF and link it to the first shader input. Then for the second input, we can just add an RGB node. And this is where we will set the color for our steam. And I'll just leave it as it is. Now if we look here, we can see that we get this kind of grainy effect. And to fix that, we can go to the material properties and change the render method to blended. And now this looks a lot more clean. Now, just having a flat plane doesn't look that great. So I also want to add some variation in the geometry. And there are different ways we could do that. You could, for example, use a displace modifier, like we did with the seaweed and meat. But I'm not going to do that here, because I want the displacement to be seamlessly animated. And that's easiest to do if we create the displacement directly in the material. And it's very easy to do. We just have to add a noise texture and a displacement node. Then we can take the FAC from the noise texture and plug it into the height of the displacement node. And then we can take the displacement output and plug that into the displacement input of the material output node. Then for the displacement to work, we also need to give the plane some geometry to displace. So I go to the modifier properties and add a subdivision surface modifier. And I'll increase the levels to 5 for both the viewport and the render. And I'll also right click and shade smooth. I'll then select the noise texture here and press Ctrl T to get the mapping and the texture coordinate nodes. And I'll use the object output here. To make it easier to see what the displacement node is doing, I'll also temporarily add a diffuse BSDF node and plug that into the surface input of the material output node. Now, if we look here, we can see that there is some kind of effect happening with the displacement. And we can see that even more clearly if I increase the scale value. But we can also see here that the plane is still completely flat. So for this to actually displace the geometry, we have to go to the material properties. And here where it says displacement, we can change that to displacement and bump. And now we can clearly see here how the geometry is being displaced. And I'll set the scale to a lower value. I can also change the scale of the noise texture. Let's set that to something like 3. And I think I'll increase the scale for the displacement slightly. Something like this should work. We can then plug the mix shader into the surface input of the material output again, and delete the diffuse node. If you go to the white color stop on the color ramp, you can adjust the value to control the visibility of the steam, and I'll set that to a low value, like 0.160 seems to work. Now we still have this sharp cutoff here at the edges of the plane, and we need to fix that. And to do that, I'll add a gradient texture. And then press Ctrl T. And I'll use the object output here. I'll also add a color ramp and link the gradient texture to it. And then I can press Ctrl Shift and the left click to preview the effect. I'll then switch the gradient type to spherical. And I'll move it slightly along the y-axis. Then we can also play with the X and Y scale here to control where the steam will be visible. I'm also going to change the interpolation here to B-spline to make the transition extra smooth. And then we can take the black stop and move it in slightly. And then I'll also go back here and adjust the Y location a bit. And we can also adjust the X scale further. and also the Y scale, to get something like this. Now, to make this gradient effect control where the steam should appear, we have to mix this with the steam texture. So I'll add a mix color node, and I'll place it here with the color ramp going into the A input. Then I'll set the factor to 1, set the blending mode to multiply, and plug this color ramp into the B input. And now we can see how the steam appears in the section we defined. And we can then take the result from this mix node and plug it into the first shader input of the mix shader node. And now if we preview this, we can see that we have something that looks more like steam here. Now if I go over to this mapping node, I can adjust the Y location here. And when I adjust it, you can see how it kind of makes it appear as if the steam is animated and going up. So this means that if we want the steam to be moving up, we just need to animate this value here. And I'll show you how to do that now. And I'll also show you how you can easily make the animation loop seamlessly. So first of all, I'll set this value back to 0. Then I'll take the texture coordinate node and move it over here to give us some space to work with. Then I'll press Shift A and add a value node. And then with Shift D, I'll duplicate the value node 2 times. Then I'll select the first value node, and if you press F2, you can change the label for the node. And I'll call this frame driver. Then I'll select the second node, press F2, and I'll call this one noise speed. And then the last one I'll call loop frames. Then I'll add a math node. And I'll set the operation to truncated modulo. Then I'll take the frame driver and plug it into the first value input. And I'll take the loop frames and plug that into the second input. Then here, I'll add a driver by using the frame expression, which we can do by writing #frame. Then on the loop frames, I'll be using the same value as the amount of frames in the animation. And to see and control how many frames that will be, I'll create another window. And then I'll switch to the timeline here. And we can then see that right now we have 250 frames. You can use that value if you want, or you can make the animation have more or fewer frames. I'll reduce mine a bit so that it's faster to render, so I'll set mine to 128. But you can use whatever value you want. Then I'll use the same number on the loop frames node, so I'll just write 128 here. Then I'll add another math node. And I'll set the operation for this one to multiply. Then I'll take the output from this node and plug it into the first input here. And I'll also take the noise speed and plug it into the second input. Then here, we can choose how fast the steam should be moving. And I'll set that to 0.002 for now. Now we want to use this to animate the location, but we can't plug it directly into the location of the mapping node, because that would affect all 3 location axes. And we specifically want to use it to animate the Y location, and maybe even the Z location, but not the X location. So to use it for the specific axis we want, we can take a combine XYZ node and plug the value into the Y location here. Then we'll plug the output from this node into the location on the mapping node. And now, if we play the animation, we can see that the steam is moving. And if you think it's moving too slow, you can just increase the speed. But if we look closer at this, we can see that the steam is moving in the wrong direction. It's going down, but we of course want it to go up. So to fix that, we can just go over to the frame driver and add a minus in front of frame to switch the direction. And now the steam is moving up like we want. And we'll also need to add a minus on the loop frames node as well. Now if we look at the effect here, it's going up like we want, but the shapes in the nose texture don't change at all. There's no variation. But if we look at the Z location instead, we can see that now the shapes change, but it's not going up. So to get the best effect, we can use both the Y and the Z. And now the noise is going up, and there is some variation in the noise as it's going up. Now the animation is still not looping seamlessly, which we can see when it reaches the end of the animation. So there's this clear jump that we need to fix. And to do that, I'll select these nodes. And then with Shift D, I can duplicate them. Then I want to link this mapping node to the same texture coordinate node we used for the first one. But to keep it a bit cleaner, we can use a reroute node on the first link. And to do that, you can hold down Shift and the right mouse button, and then drag on the link to create a reroute node. And then we can connect this to the mapping node. Then here, I'll duplicate this multiply node, but I'll change the operation to subtract. Then we can plug this into the first value input on the multiply node. And then we can take the noise speed and link it to the second input. Then we can take the output from the truncated modulo and link it to the first value input of the subtract node. And for the second input, we can use the loop frames. Then we just need to mix this nose texture with the nose texture here. So to do that, we can take a mix color node. Then take the FAC from the first nose texture and plug it into the A input. And take the FAC from the second nose texture and plug that into the B input. Then the factor here will be used to switch between the two nose textures. And for this to work seamlessly, we need to go over here and duplicate the subtract node with Shift D. And we'll set the operation to divide. Then we can take the truncated modulo and plug it into the first value input of this node. And for the second input, we'll use the loop frames. Then we can take this divide node and plug it into the factor of the mixed color node. Then we can plug this mixed color into the color ramp here. And now if we preview this, and if we play the animation, we should now see that the animation loops seamlessly. So there's no jump at all. Now if I add in a diffuse node temporarily again, and link it to the material output, we can see that when I play the animation, the displacement is still not animated. And I would like the location here to be animated as well. So to fix that, I'll just move these nodes over here. Then I can remove this node. And instead I'll add a reroute here by holding down Shift and the right mouse button while dragging over it. And then I'll connect this to the mapping node. And we can add another reroute here as well, just to keep it more clean. Then we can take the output from this first combine XYZ node and link it to the location input of the mapping node down here. And we can also duplicate these two nodes. And then I'll connect this to the second mapping node as well. Then take the output from the other combine XYZ node and plug it into the location of this mapping node. Then we need to mix the noise textures together. So I'll add a mix color node, then take the FAC of this node and plug it into the A input, and take the FAC of this node and plug it into the B input. Then for the factor, we can take the output from the divide node up here and plug that into the factor. Then just take the result from the mix color and plug that into the displacement height. And now, if I play the animation, we can see that the displacement is also animated now. And I can then link the mix shader to the material output again and delete the diffuse node. And now the steam is basically done. If you want, you can add more value nodes to be able to control the values of multiple noise textures at the same time. So for example, if we want to control the scale here, we can add a value node and link it to both of these nodes. And then you can control the scale with just one value, and we can call it noise scale. And you can do the same for any other values you want. Now, if you want to understand the logic behind what we just did here, I'd recommend watching rcpongo's video on creating perfect animated noise loops in Blender. The base of it is very similar to his setup in that video, and he explains the logic behind it very well. I'll leave a link to it in the description. It's not exactly the same though, because I had to modify it a bit to make it work with the Steam setup here. For example, in his video, he animates noise textures directly by using the W value. But in my setup, I didn't do that, for two reasons. The first reason is that in order to get the W value on the noise texture, the dimensions need to be set to 4D. And if you have a lot of noise textures using 4D, it can affect performance quite a lot. And the second reason is that animating the W value only changes the noise variation. It doesn't actually move the noise up. So I also had to figure out a way to get that upward motion. And that's where the Combine XYZ node comes in, since it allows us to animate the Y-axis to move the noise upward. And to get the noise variation as well, we just use the Z-axis. And that way, we didn't have to use any 4D noise textures at all. And with that, this scene is now done. And the only thing left to do now is to render the animation. Before doing that, we can just quickly go to the output properties to configure the settings for our render. First of all, we have the render resolution. If you're happy with your values here, you can keep it as it is. I'll be rendering my scene in a few different resolutions. This is one of them, but I'll also render one version for YouTube, and for that I can go with 1280 for X and 720 for Y. And I'll keep the percentage at 200. Then, to get the whole scene in the camera frame with these resolutions, I could just select the camera, then go to the data properties and adjust the focal length. So something like this would work for YouTube. Then I'll also be rendering for Instagram, and for that I could just go for 1080 for both X and Y. And then I would have to adjust the focal length here as well. So something like this should work for Instagram. Then before we render, we also have to pick where the rendered output should be saved. So you can choose a location here. And finally, we have the file format. So you can choose whatever format you want to render it in. If you want it to be saved as a video directly, you can pick this video option here. Then we just have to go to render and pick render animation. And then you just have to wait for all your frames to be rendered. And that's all for this tutorial series. I hope it wasn't too hard to follow along and that you ended up with a result you're happy with. If you made this scene and decide to post it on social media, feel free to tag me in your posts. I'd love to see your final results. And that's all from me, so thanks for watching.